When you start looking at high-end mobile workstations, the biggest question that keeps me up at night is whether the machine will actually make my daily workflow smoother or just sit on my desk gathering dust. I've spent the last week digging through spec sheets, watching a handful of tech reviewers, and scrolling through user forums just to see what people really say after they've logged a few hundred hours on the device. The ThinkPad P17 G2 lands in that sweet spot where a lot of pros are tempted. It promises a massive 17-inch display, a desktop-class CPU, and enough RAM to keep dozens of apps open without a hiccup. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. What I'm trying to figure out here is if the price tag matches the real-world value, and who should actually consider buying this laptop versus those who would be better off with something lighter or cheaper. First, let's talk about the core of any workstation, the processor. The 11th Gen i7-11850H is an 8-core chip that pushes up to 4.9 GHz with turbo boost. In theory that sounds like lightning fast, but the true test is how it behaves when you're juggling the tools you use every day. I ran a typical CAD workload, ThinkStation, SolidWorks, and a couple of background renders, and the CPU never idled below 30% while the models were loading. The real kicker was when I added a full video edit timeline in DaVinci Resolve. Even with 4K footage, the render times were on par with a desktop equipped with a similar Xeon chip, which tells me the CPU truly lives up to the desktop-class promise without throttling under sustained load. That matters for engineers, architects, and media creators who can't afford to stare at a frozen screen while a simulation runs. Memory is another factor that often gets glossed over in marketing copy. The P17 G2 ships with 32 GB of DDR4 RAM, which is more than enough for most professional software stacks. In practice, I was able to keep a full-screen CAD model, a Photoshop document with several layers, and a virtual machine running a test Linux environment all open with no noticeable slowdown. For people who need to run multiple virtual machines or keep a large database query open while they design, this is a genuine productivity booster. The downside is that the RAM is not user upgradable without opening the chassis, so if you ever anticipate needing 64 GB down the line, you'll have to buy a different configuration up front. Now, the display. A 17.3-inch screen at 192011080 feels almost nostalgic when you compare it to the 4K panels that dominate the market, but the size alone makes a difference. Working on a complex assembly in SolidWorks feels less cramped, and the extra screen real estate reduces the need to constantly pan and zoom. The panel's color accuracy lands in the good enough for professional work range, which is fine for most CAD and data analysis tasks, though graphic designers who demand near-perfect sRGB coverage might still want an external monitor. The trade-off here is weight. The laptop tips the scales at just under 7 kilograms, about 15 pounds, so it's not a daily commuter's companion. If you're planning on moving it between office rooms rather than across cities, that's acceptable. Otherwise, you might find the heft a constant reminder that this is a desktop replacement, not a tablet-style ultrabook. Graphics performance comes from the NVIDIA RTX T1200, a card that sits a step below the full RTX series but still offers 4 GB of dedicated memory. In my tests, the GPU handled most 3D modeling tasks without a hitch, and even a moderate Unreal Engine render ran at playable frame rates. The card isn't built for heavy-duty gaming or intensive AI workloads, but for professionals who need GPU acceleration for simulation or light rendering, it provides excellent ability, as the spec sheet claims. The limitation shows up when you try to push large VR scenes, the frame rates dip, and you start feeling the thermal throttling after about 30 minutes of continuous use. So, if your primary workflow is GPU-bound, consider a workstation with an RTX A2000 or higher. If graphics are a secondary need, the T1200 will serve you well without inflating the price. One aspect I often hear people overlook is the storage solution. A 1TB NVMe SSD gives you not just capacity but also the kind of read/write speeds that let large project files open in seconds. The drive is user replaceable, which is a nice nod to the service-friendly reputation that ThinkPads have earned over the years. In practice, loading a multi-gigabyte SolidWorks assembly took under 10 seconds, a noticeable improvement over older SATA-based workstations I've used. The only practical downside is that the laptop doesn't come with a secondary drive bay, so if you need a backup or a dedicated scratch disk, you'll have to rely on external solutions. Let's talk software. The machine runs Windows 10 Pro, which brings the improved snapping and virtual desktop features that make multitasking feel smoother. I especially like the ability to snap two full-screen apps side by side and then pull a third into view with the new 22 layout. For anyone who constantly has a spreadsheet, a CAD view,